Welcome to the Solocast of Firecode Tech. In these episodes, it's just going to be me, your host, Gus Gagliardi. There's going to be a range of topics, but I'm going to talk about specific technologies, installation standards, codes and how they work, as well as some other interesting topics that don't neatly fit inside of the context of a normal interview. Hello all, welcome to episode 4 of the Solocast of Firecode Tech. On this Solocast we have standpipes. So this is a really big topic and I'm sure I'll talk about it on multiple videos, but it's one that's near and dear to my heart, and so I had trouble understanding the requirements around standpipes when I first started to branch over into the FPE part of my career, and so I want to kind of highlight the codes and standards as well as some of the things that I've learned about BIM coordination and installation for standpipes. So yeah, I'm going to try to start off very basic and then see how much I can get out of this topic, since there's a lot, there's a huge amount to what standpipes are and when you need them, and the different varietals. So excited about this one. So for preface, I want to get started with the codes surrounding the standpipe systems. So I'm going to start off with the International Building Code and address the code section that talks about standpipes. So how do you know if you need a standpipe system? So if you live in the US and you're working in a jurisdiction that adopts the International Building Code, what you would do is take a look at section 905, which is standpipe systems, and take a look at the requirements for when these systems are required. And so essentially, if your building meets one of these criteria, then you are required to have a standpipe system. And so let's go over a couple of those criteria that might require your building to have a standpipe system. 905.1 says standpipe systems shall be provided in new buildings and structures in accordance with sections 905.2 through 905.10. In buildings used for high-piled combustible storage, fire protection shall be in accordance with the International Fire Code. 905.2 dictates the installation standard, which is NFPA 14, the other document that drives the install and the other applicable equipment requirements for standpipe systems. So here's where we get into some of the criteria in the International Building Code, which dictate when these systems are required. 905.3, required installations, starts to go over some of the factors in which you might need, some of the building factors which might put you into a category of building that requires a standpipe systems. So the first factor is height. The 905.3.1 says Class 3 standpipe systems shall be installed throughout the buildings where the floor level of the highest story is located more than 30 feet above the lowest level of fire department vehicle access. I'll be sure to put a picture of this up in the show notes, but essentially this means that wherever you have, wherever your fire department access is, if your building has an occupiable floor 30 feet above this area, then your building is required to have a standpipe. This is important because this is probably the most frequent determining factor for throwing your building into a class of building which requires a standpipe system. So that's the first and the foremost. Interesting that it's listed first. An interesting note about this requirement and just how it fits into the building code is there are significant requirements for your building if you have exits that are, if you have stories which are 30 feet above or below the level of exit discharge or the fire department access. So there's big life safety implications when you start adding significant height on your building and you don't have a way to immediately exit to an egress path on ground level or the level of fire department access in this case. Furthermore, in this 905.3.1 section describing the height and how that requirement is there for buildings of a appreciable height to be required to have standpipes, there are some exceptions for what type of standpipe is required. And so you can take a look at those, but I'm just going to keep going on to the factors for building features that would require a standpipe. The next factor, you could say, in 905.3.2 is Group A occupancies. And it says Class 1 automatic wet standpipes shall be provided in non-sprinkler Group A buildings that have an occupant load exceeding 1,000 persons. That seems like a strange one because I feel like if you have an A occupancy with 1,000 people, maybe there are some existing construction examples, but generally you would be required to have sprinklers at that point anyways. So in a lot of instances, so that's an interesting caveat there. 905.3.3 covered mall and open mall buildings. So, another requirement tying back to large amounts of people. Covered mall and open mall buildings shall be equipped throughout with a standpipe system where required by 905.3.1. Mall buildings not required to be equipped with a standpipe system shall be equipped with a Class 1 hose connections throughout the automatic sprinkler system sized to deliver 250 gallons per minute. So here's a set of, open malls or malls in general have some extra occupancy requirements just due to the nature of the facility. So the next factor just below here is 905.3.4 stages. So this can be a tricky one. It's a good one to remember that stages over a certain amount have life safety implications. I was working on like a community center and it ended up having a fairly large stage. So in this case, if it's greater than 1,000 square feet, you have to have a class 3 wet standpipe with the 1.5 and 2.5 inch hose connections on each side of the stage. But it looks like there's an exception for automatic sprinkler systems. But if you have a small building with a big stage, which could happen, this might trigger you. Here's that height thing coming back into play that we spoke of earlier. 905.3.5 underground buildings shall be equipped throughout with a Class 1 automatic wet or manual standpipe. Underground buildings probably has a very specific meaning in the definitions. And so I'm just going to rip off the last couple of these requirement occupancies, if you will. They're all kind of the same. Helistops and heliports, 905.3.6. Marinas and boatyards, 905.3.7. And then rooftop gardens and landscaped roofs. So let's go through, we didn't talk about, probably should have talked about this first. What is a standpipe system? That's a great question. Let's take a look at the definition in NFPA 14. I'm looking at the 2019 edition, and this is 3.3.20. Standpipe system, an arrangement of piping valves, hose connections, and associated equipment installed in a building or structure with the hose connections located in such a manner that water can be discharged in streams or spray patterns through the attached hose and nozzles for the purpose of extinguishing a fire, thereby protecting a building structure and its contents, in addition to protecting the occupants. So the next thing I want to talk about is what are the different classes and types of standpipe systems. So I want to focus on a little bit of some of these definitions in NFPA 14. And I think it's important because, the building code references the different classes of standpipe and when they're required. And so I think it's a really good baseline to have as an understanding to know what are the different types of systems and what's most common. So I'll go over in my experience what systems are most common and the different types of systems. So let's get into it. So we have first of all, there's system classes. So this is standpipe system classes. So we have class 1 through 3. So I just will read the definitions. It's just as exposition on different standpipe classes. So we have class 1, a system that provides a 2.5-inch hose connection to supply water use for fire departments. So the big difference between all these system classes are the valving is similar for all these systems, but the thing that changes is what sized hose connections are provided. So class 1 is 2.5-inch. This is a fairly common class. I'd say in my experience, one of the most common. So class 2 is a system that provides 1.5-inch hose stations to supply water for use primarily by trained personnel or by fire department during initial response. Class 3 is a system that provides 1.5-inch hose stations to supply water for use by trained personnel and 2.5-inch hose connections to supply larger volume water for use by fire departments. So I'd say I've seen Class 3 the least, and Class 1 the most, and then Class 2 probably second most common. So generally, if you have Class 1 standpipes in your stairwells, they're going to be 2.5-inch. And so Class 2 standpipes, is instance in which you would have those are for high piled storage or oftentimes in the ancillary portion of the facility for hangars. This is where you would have Class 2 standpipe systems. So these 1.5-inch hose lines provided throughout the facility to basically help the firefighting personnel. So now that we've talked about the different classes, let's talk about, so just like fire suppression systems, so sprinkler systems, there are wet and dry standpipes, and so there's a couple different varietals of wet and dry standpipes, but the one thing that standpipe has that sprinklers don't have is the automatic and manual. So a manual standpipe system is where the pumper for the fire service has to hook up to a hydrant and then charge the system with water. So, or basically, they don't have to charge it with water, but they have to provide the pressure and flow in order to make this system work. So that's a manual system. So there's manual wet and manual dry, and I'll get into more specifics on the definitions for these, but in broad terms, manual wet means that the system is charged with water, but the system is not intended to be able to provide the hydraulic characteristics that is required. And then manual dry means there's no water in the system, and the only time that you get water in the system is when you the pumper hooks up to the the pumper hooks up to the fire hydrant, and then they hook up to the FDC connection where they will put water into the system in order to provide a charged line where the fire service needs to attack the fire. So automatic, what does automatic mean? Automatic means that this system is attached to a means to provide the system hydraulic characteristics. I'm sure I'll get into the hydraulic characteristics. I don't know if I'll do it in this episode, how it's calced. Yeah, so it's hooked up to a water source or a water supply that has the ability to provide the capacity for the hydraulics required for a standpipe system. So generally this is a fire pump. Imagine there could be other water supply scenarios in which I guess it would have to be a fire pump at some point. If not in the building, then at the distribution level, I guess you could have a city with a stout enough water supply curve to basically consider it automatic. But so that's it for the episode 4 of the Solocast of Fire Code Tech. In our first episode about standpipes, As you can tell, I barely just scratched the surface of things that we could talk about pertaining to standpipes. We still didn't touch hydraulic calculations. We didn't really touch location or coordination items. And so I'm going to keep going into standpipes in future installments. Don't know when I get back to it because I want to keep these varied to keep people interested. But yeah. Oh, and don't forget, if you liked this episode, you can go get another bonus episode about standpipe where I do an additional 15 minutes. Future topics about standpipes. I get into NFPA 14 a little bit more in the bonus episode, talking about some of the different system types. And so get into that a little bit more. But yeah, if you want to check that out, that's patreon.com/firecodetech. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time on Firecode Tech. Thanks for listening, everybody. Be sure to share the episode with a friend if you enjoyed it. Don't forget that fire protection and life safety is serious business. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are by no means a professional consultation or a codes and standards interpretation. Be sure to contact a licensed professional if you are getting involved with fire protection and or life safety. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.